I want to say thank you to Bob. There are two people here who I used to work for, Bob and Steve Denning. They both underpaid me dramatically. And the bitterness has not gone away, let me say that. I also want to thank you guys for sticking around. I know that we're not scheduled to be done until 1:20, so that's pretty late, and I very much appreciate you staying here. But when I introduce the panel, you'll know that it's definitely worth it. Not for me, but for them. So Noah Diefenbaugh is the Associate Professor of Environmental Earth Science System at the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment. Peter Glick is the President and Co-founder of the Pacific Institute. Wade Crowfoot is the Deputy Cabinet Secretary and Senior Advisor in the Office of California Governor Jerry Brown. So his boss is here, so he's under a ton of pressure. I want a lot of applause for Wade when he talks, so it'll look good in front of his boss. And Saul Shang is the Assistant Professor of Public Policy at the Goldman School of Public Policy at the University of California, Berkeley. So as Bob said, we're looking at water policy today, and we're looking at it in the context of a time when the world is undergoing climate change. And in particular, we're all sitting in the middle of California, and we're undergoing a historic drought. You know, we've always had droughts and wildfires in the state of California, but right now, 100% of California is experiencing, quote unquote, severe drought. 2013 was the driest year in California's 119-year recorded history, and the latest 12 months are the driest on record as well. So we know that we're under a severe water situation. I'm not sure in my own mind how much of that is cyclical. We've had droughts before. How much of it is secular? So we have a group of experts here to talk about the interaction of what naturally occurs and what's happening in this specific time as a result of a changing climate. And in particular, when we're talking about water policy, we're talking about it in a place that is in crisis, and we can use California as an example of understanding the crisis itself, talking about the impacts, and then talking about what the right policies are going forward. So that is really, we're going to take this discussion, this hour, in those three parts. We're going to ask the scientists first, how much of what is going on here relates to climate change? How much of it is just the normal cyclical droughts that Californians have experienced forever? Then we're going to talk, and Wade is here, about what is the impact on Californians? How is it manifesting itself for the citizens of our state? What are the impacts? And then thirdly, we've heard a lot of talk in the previous two panels about innovation. We've heard a lot of talk about markets, but hopefully we can step back a second from those, specific focus and try and put the policy solutions in a framework so we understand how we're dealing with them. Should we be dealing with them from a mitigation standpoint? Should we be adapting? Let's try and understand a little better how the system itself works and what we're trying to do in the long term. So with that, let's start by asking Peter the basic question, which is, what are the broad impacts of climate change on our water systems in California? How are the two systems linked, and what is the latest data telling us?
Well, thank you, Tom. And thanks to all of you. Probably like many of you, I've been to a lot of water meetings. It's great to see this level of interest in the quality of the conversation. It's great to see that the governor is interested in this issue, but not only that, he's sat through this whole thing. And again, like many of you, I've been to meetings where politicians come and they open a meeting and then they leave. And it's a sign of his commitment to these issues. So thank you, Governor. And it's raining. Don't go home. It does not mean the drought is over. I promise you that. So I'm going to try and do four quick things to frame this as Tom has described. The first is to say that the climate's changing. We know that. We know that the climate's changing because of human activities. We know that. There's a long history of the science of this, and I'll come back to a little bit of that in a second. The second point is that among the worst impacts of climate change are going to be on water resources. The hydrologic cycle is the climate cycle. As we change the climate, we're going to affect water. And not just the natural system, but we're going to affect the infrastructure and the massive institutions that we put in place to manage water as well. So that's the second point. The third is the impacts of climate change on water systems, I think, shine a spotlight on the false dichotomy between mitigation and adaptation on climate. Now, maybe if we had had this level of a conversation 30 or 40 years ago, we could have really focused on mitigation, but the truth is that ship has sailed, and we're now in a world in which we have to mitigate by reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but we have no choice but to deal with unavoidable impacts of climate change on our water systems and many other things as well. So set aside that dichotomy. You may prefer mitigation, you may prefer adaptation, but we have to do both. The fourth, and the panelists will come back to this, is what do we do about it? On the technology side, on the economic side, on the policy side, on the communication side. All of this is wrapped up. On the impacts of climate change on water, this is a big topic because water is connected to everything we care about. It's connected to energy and human health and ecosystems and our economy and food and agriculture. And as the climate changes, it's going to affect all of the pieces of that. Temperatures are going up. It's not only the driest year on record, 2013. In fact, the last 36 months from October 1, going back 36 months in California, have been the 36 driest months on record in California and the 36 hottest months in California's 120 years of recorded instrumental record. It's not only been dry, it's been hot, and that's part of the debate here. As temperature goes up, the demand for water goes up. It takes more water to do the things that we want. If you want to grow a green lawn, maybe we'll comment on that later, it's going to take more water under a hotter climate. So temperature alone is important. Precipitation's going to change, and precipitation's a little tougher. The models are a little bit ambiguous about California because we're in a geographically kind of a strange place. Our water comes in big events off the Pacific. We have to understand storm patterns and so on. Noah's going to talk about the work that he's been doing, linking precipitation patterns in California and drought. It's complicated. But we do know that the science suggests we're going to get more extreme events on both ends of the tail of the spectrum, wet and dry. We do know with much less uncertainty about precipitation. Uncertainty to a scientist means there's a range of outcomes. Uncertainty to the public means you guys don't know what you're talking about. So when I say uncertainty, there's a range of outcomes. We do know with very little uncertainty that we're going to lose snowpack in California. And frankly, this was my dissertation 30 years ago. It gets hotter, the snow line moves up, we're going to lose snowpack. It may rain the same amount, it may precipitate the same amount, but we're going to get more rain, less snow. What falls as snow is going to melt faster and run off earlier, and we already see changes in the timing of runoff in California. Extreme events, we'll talk about more. Sea level rise, the governor mentioned sea level rise. Sea level rise, here's an impact probably most of you haven't thought about. There are 22 wastewater treatment plants in the Bay Area alone at risk of a 1 meter sea level rise, which is well within what we expect over the coming decades. They discharge wastewater, which maybe we shouldn't do, as Orange County has shown us, and we can come back and talk about that. But sea level rise is going to affect all sorts of things that we don't typically think about. Coastal aquifers will be affected by sea level rise. Ecosystems, systems operations, how we choose to operate the dams and reservoirs that we've built will be affected by climate change, by sea level rise, by changes in the timing of runoff. So it's not just the hydrology, it's the systems as well. And the final point I want to make is that despite the fact that we've been talking about this stuff for a long time, and I participated in 1991 in a conversation among climate scientists and water managers in California and Sacramento, our water managers are still not sure what to do about this. They're not sure how to integrate the coming changes that we now are pretty confident about into management. And in the broader discussion about all of the difficult things that we talk about, water rights, water laws, institutions, the pricing, we now have this additional complication that the climate is no longer static. And we'll come back to that. So I'll stop there.
Okay. Since you introduced it, Noah, why don't you talk a little bit about how you see the connection? I know there's been some controversy about whether this drought is directly related to climate change, and I know that Stanford's done a bunch of work on it. But I'm not sure that some of the people here aren't as familiar as you are with that work that you've been doing. So why don't you explain a little bit about how the current drought is affected by climate change and what we can expect going forward in terms of, as the climate changes, what is that going to mean for us in terms of water?
Absolutely. Yeah, so I think this is really a question about risk, and Chris Field is here, he's co-chair of the Working Group 2 of the IPCC, and this is one of the big messages coming out of the IPCC reports that have been released over the last year, is that it's really about the risk, the probability of a physical hazard like a heat wave or a drought or a severe storm, and how that interacts with ecosystems, how that interacts with people, the exposure and vulnerability of different systems. And I think the current drought in California is a great example of climate risk. We know that it's a rare event. We heard that. We know it's rare in terms of how extremely low the precipitation has been. We know that we understand really well the atmospheric causes, why it hasn't been raining. This ridiculously resilient ridge, as my grad student Daniel Swain has coined this atmospheric feature over the Pacific. And you can think about it as it's a ridge of high pressure. It's basically a boulder that's been plopped into a stream, and the storms that normally would come to California have been diverted poleward towards Canada and Alaska. And it's just sort of been parked there for a long time. So we know it's a rare event. Both the causes are rare, how extremely dry it's been is rare. And really the question is about risk. And part of the question is, how rare are these atmospheric conditions? And our recent paper, we've concluded that the global warming has very likely increased the probability of those atmospheric conditions by about a factor of 3. So still rare, but from the perspective of risk, if we say we're having the most severe drought, in terms of low precipitation and in terms of impact, and it's 3 times more likely because of global warming, that's not saying, that the CO2 that came out of my minivan caused the drought, but it is saying that we're experiencing an increased risk of this kind of event. The second thing we've been working on, which hasn't been published yet, but that we're writing up now, relates to what Peter was talking about temperature. And we know that when it's warm, snow melts earlier, more precipitation comes as rain rather than snow. We know that soils dry out faster when it's hotter. And what we've been doing over the last several months in my lab is we've been looking back at new data that have been released by the National Climate Data Center. And we now have access to observations going back 120 years of temperature and precipitation and drought. And so we've been looking back at the frequency of low precipitation in California, the frequency of warm temperatures, and I've actually been quite surprised to find that back earlier in the record, in the early 20th century, the mid 20th century, temperature and precipitation were pretty uncoupled, as we say scientifically. So it really was like flipping two coins separately, and we had about 50% chance of getting a warm year and 50% chance of getting a cool year. We had about 50% chance of getting a wet year and 50% chance of getting a dry year, and they were pretty independent. We flipped the 2 coins together. About a quarter of them turned out to be warm and dry. About a quarter of them turned out to be cool and dry. And what's happened is that because of global warming, which we know with high confidence, the temperatures in California have been increasing. California's been getting warmer. And this has really changed the probability of getting, of the state being warm or even hot when we have the bad luck of it being dry. And we know that looking back at these long records, that a warm, dry year is much more likely to produce a severe drought. In fact, it's about twice as likely when we look back at the whole 120-year record. So what's happened is, even though precipitation is noisy, even though climate models have some uncertainty about precipitation, we know with very high confidence that when we get low precipitation in California, we're about twice as likely to have a severe drought if it's also warm when the precipitation is low. And we know that over the last 20 years, that global warming has substantially increased the probability of years being warm. And now we're at the point where we essentially have a 100% chance of having a warm or even hot year in California. And so we're approaching, it's going to sound hyperbolic, but we're essentially approaching 100% risk of kind of drought-inducing conditions because of this increase in temperature. And so I think that Tom mentioned there's been debate in the media about the connection between climate change and drought in California. And I think that really, a lot of this is kind of spurious debate about precipitation. And really, we have such high confidence in the effect of global warming on temperature in California that we really do have high confidence that just because of that temperature effect, that we're substantially increasing the risk of severe drought, just because of the odds of having high temperatures when precipitation is low.
So you've been talking about risk and the risk of outcomes, and I want to ask Saul a question about what it is we have at risk in terms of the economy. So when we think about undergoing this severe drought, what are the things we're trying to protect? I mean, we obviously have fires. People mentioned the ski industry. The agriculture is 80% of our water use. When you think about the risks to the economy, the risks to the people of California, how do you categorize what we should be worried about?
That's an excellent question. The way to think about the economic risk of climate change and the drought is to think about how it projects onto the economy. And the economy is made out of a bunch of building blocks: people, crops, buildings, and infrastructure. And we see that the drought and climate change affects the productivity of those individual building blocks. And when you turn the lever on the productivity of every little person working or every field in the economy, it aggregates up to have really large economic effects nationally. And so in some very new work that we're just completing, we're actually seeing, for example, that on very hot days, counties lose basically $20 per person. So a day above 86 degrees Fahrenheit costs each county $20 bill per person. And now if you add that up over 300 million Americans across many days in the year, and in the Risky Business report that we did together, we saw that in the future, the number of these extreme events is going to go up dramatically to be 20, 30, 50 of these a year in some locations. These aggregate up to be very large economic costs. And it's entering through sort of its individual effects on people, but predominantly on agriculture. So agriculture is one of the most vulnerable sectors. This ends up manifesting in the price of land in the economy. So if land is expected to be very productive for agriculture, it's going to cost a lot in the marketplace. And as people see the productivity of that land decline, because it's expected to experience more hot days, it's going to have weaker rights to water, perhaps, or it's going to have less rainfall, people are going to be willing to pay less for that land. And so the people who own that land are the real losers. They're the ones who are losing a valuable asset in real time as the climate deteriorates. And so one way we've dealt with that in the past is to build a lot of infrastructure that helps supplement and smooth out these types of fluctuations. These are all the things we've been talking about, the massive water infrastructure projects over the last century. Now, those are all distributed across the state and across the country in such a way so that the water that falls in places far away from the consumer can be transported to the consumer in an efficient manner. But as these patterns, these climate patterns change, the quality of that infrastructure in terms of being an efficient transportation network is going to change because the precipitation is no longer going to fall where it used to fall, even though the demand is going to be growing simultaneously like we were talking about before. And so you have these simultaneous problems of infrastructure that's now not allocated in the optimum way, at the same time that the climate is also reducing the productivity of individual locations, and that's causing the value of land to depreciate even faster. And so these are some of the biggest risks to the economy directly. Now, what we should do is we should think about how do we plan going forward, but the problem is climate change also makes the future more uncertain. So coming up with long-term plans is going to become increasingly difficult, because as the climate changes, we are forced to rely more and more on models, projections of the future, less and less on historical data, because that historical data is no longer valid. But because of that, we are now not sure of what the right course of action is. And so that uncertainty also creates an additional economic burden on planners and on government in terms of thinking about sort of what should we do moving forward. So these are the different angles in which the economy is extremely vulnerable, and sort of the challenges that it poses to policymakers trying to make new investments, new long-term investments in this highly uncertain environment.
So fortunately, we have the government sitting directly to your right. Wade, let me ask you two questions. One, and they're connected. One is, can you just tell us the impacts that you're seeing in California, the people are coming to you and saying, help, in effect? And secondly, I'm sure that especially the out-of-state people are intimately familiar with Prop 1, but in any case, it might, just to refresh their memory of some of the details, maybe you'd explain a little bit what the current proposition is to ameliorate some of the long-term problems that we're looking at.
Sure. So it's been a sobering summer in the work that I do. If any of you got in your car after this conference and drove 3 hours east of here and went to Madera County or Tulare County, Kings County, you would encounter thousands of people that live in homes that don't have any water. They turn on the tap and they don't have water for drinking, they don't have water for washing themselves, much less washing their dishes or their clothes. A few weeks ago, a letter came across my desk from a woman named Jean Wilson in Madera County. And you can't obviously respond to all of the requests from constituents, but this one caught my attention, and I actually spent an hour on the phone with this woman, Mrs. Wilson, and she lives in Madera County, and she literally has elderly neighbors of hers coming up to her doorstep with jugs of water who don't look like they've taken a shower in days, asking where they can find water. This is California in 2014, and you're seeing this level of desperation. It should be noted that beginning this spring, our emergency drinking water program at the state started hearing from communities, some very small, some communities you've heard of or visited, like Willits or Healdsburg or Cloverdale, that basically indicated they were in danger of running out of water in 90 to 120 days. These are groundwater tables, and these are places that don't experience frequent cyclical water shortages. In the case of Tulare County, many of the folks that don't have water have been in these homes for 50 years and never thought they would encounter this problem. So drinking water is probably the most severe and sort of alarming impact of climate-driven drought that we're seeing. Agriculture is perhaps more well-known. We in the state contracted with the UC Davis Watershed Sciences Center to do a model of what are the economic impacts to agriculture from the drought. And their model, which is actually borne out to be very accurate, suggested California agriculture will be short about 6.7 million acre-feet of water this year. It will make up for that shortage with about 5 million acre-feet of groundwater pumping. So over about two-thirds gets made up by groundwater pumping. The resulting shortage of 1.7 million acre-feet has an economic impact of about $1.5 billion. $1 billion in reduced crop yield and about $500 million in increased groundwater pumping costs. That translates to about 20,000 lost jobs, which of course has economic impacts, particularly severe in poor farming communities in the Central Valley, where we're literally shipping hundreds of thousands of boxes of emergency food to people that are without food and facing hunger. An area of impact that is certainly drought-related has to do with wildfires, of course, and our state wildfire fighting agency called CAL FIRE has reported that fires are burning faster and further than they ever have before. There was a fire a few weeks ago that many of you read about east of Sacramento called the King Fire. CAL FIRE experienced that fire moving 15 miles in one day, something that really went far beyond their modeling. In fact, the rate of speed of growth was so alarming that firefighters had to use emergency shelters and shelter in place and let the fire pass over them. That combustibility this summer has had a human impact on communities like Weed in Siskiyou County, one of our furthest north communities, where almost 200 homes were burned to the ground. It looked like an explosion hit Weed. Again, alarming because of the combustible nature of vegetation made that fire act like it never had before. Those are just probably what I consider to be the most alarming and impactful impacts of the drought this summer. And if you accept what Noah and Peter explained to us, that essentially climate change is loading the dice on this extreme weather, and these are climate-driven events, one could argue that these are really victims of climate change in our state. We so often have heard about victims of climate change in the lowlands of Bangladesh or Northern Africa with the droughts. This is impact in our state right now. And so to me, working on climate change and emergency management, this has connected the dots like never before.
So, Peter, I was going to ask you a question, but do you want to make a comment before I do?
Yeah, there are a couple more impacts that I think we ought to at least raise. One is on fisheries. You know, we see the fallow ag land, we see the fires. We don't see very well impacts on fisheries, and fisheries are already under stress because of our water conflicts and the allocation of water. In the last drought, which wasn't that long ago, some of the worst impacts were on some of the local fisheries and local fishing communities. So that's one thing that I think we need to add. Another more obvious one is hydropower, and this connects to the climate issue. So in a normal year now, we get about 15% of our electricity from hydropower. Not that we get a normal year anymore. This year, it'll be closer to 6 or 7%. The numbers aren't in yet. The Pacific Institute's just about to release an analysis of this, and our estimate is that probably over the last 3 years of drought, ratepayers have had to pay an additional $2 billion or so for additional natural gas, primarily, to replace lost hydropower. And obviously there's a climate connection there because it's increased our greenhouse gas emissions, it's increased other air quality challenges. So that's another consequence. And I think all of these things together have to be evaluated.
Now, I know we're going to spend, in terms of the public policy part, most of the time talking about adaptation, just as Peter said, because in terms of mitigation versus adaptation, we're at the point where we're going to have to be doing serious adaptation. But before we get there, I wanted to ask Noah, where we're going on this path. You were talking about the fact that, in effect, we've gone from a time when it was 50% it was going to be dry and 50% it was going to be hot to it's going to be hot, and we're going to have a lot of years that are hot and dry. On the path we're on, how is that actually going to change the actual circumstances of Californians? It's going to be hotter, but what is that really going to mean for us, over the next 25 years?
Well, so I think, I guess there's a couple ways to think about that question. One is, what do we know about projections of the next 25 years? And certainly with temperature increasing in Western North America, we have a good understanding of what that means for snow. Water, we know sort of the melting point of water quite well. If it's colder, it's solid. If it's warmer, it's liquid. And so, we know that, in much of Western North America, we're already seeing trends towards more liquid water earlier in the year. This actually was one of the first impacts of climate change that was very conclusively attributed to human emissions of greenhouse gases. This is a paper in 2008 that was one of the first impact attribution papers. This is something that the scientific community has had high confidence in, and so we're already seeing that, and we're likely to see more of it with snow melting earlier and earlier in the year, more of the water that's falling out of the sky coming as rain rather than snow, which has implications for our water infrastructure and management. So I think certainly over the next 3-decade timescale that you're talking about, we're seeing a likelihood of it's kind of an imminent shift towards this more liquid-dominated water delivery from the atmosphere in the Western United States. I think the other way to think about your question of where are we headed over the next 30 years is to think about this current event and think about the vulnerabilities and impacts that we've been hearing about in this current event. And how often would these conditions occur in terms of the climate. So that's what we've been doing in our research is asking, when we look at climate models, after we've sort of done the screening for how good are they, and I'm happy to answer any questions about that. Once we identify what we have confidence in the climate models, asking how often do those climate models give a result that looks like this year, and getting back to this this co-occurrence of dry years and hot years. That is something where we're seeing that probably over the next 2 to 3 decades, where there'll be enough warming to pretty much guarantee that when one of these really low precipitation year happens, that it happens in the context of a record high temperature. We're over the next 3 decades, we're pretty likely in the Western United States to move outside of the historical envelope of temperature where we're really seeing pretty much every year being the warmest on record.
So Peter, that brings us to the framework in terms of thinking about adapting. And I have a 2-part question. The first one is, someone said earlier today, there's plenty of water available in the system, which implies that it's just a question of allocation. That's the first part of the question. And the second part of the question is this: water isn't just a resource the way other resources are resources. At some level, water is a public resource. So when you think about water as a public resource, and then you put it in the context of markets, and you put it in the context of innovation, how should we think about allocating water, given that the current system is basically a legal system giving rights to people and protecting the status quo going back as far as 1850? Simple questions, right?
Yeah. Wasn't it Tammin who said that was a simple question? So first of all, plenty of water. In some ways, California has plenty of water. It's sort of ironic. I've done some work in the Middle East. I have friends who come from the Middle East to California. They don't understand why we have a water problem. They have a water problem. So plenty of water in a sense, but not enough water to do everything that everybody wants. And I would modify that to say not enough water to do everything that everybody wants as inefficiently as we're doing it today. So we have to make some decisions. We're at what we call peak water. You might want more water out of the Colorado River, but you can't have any more because we take it all already. You might want more water out of the Sacramento-San Joaquin Basin, but the truth is we're taking more water out than we ought to be if we care about some of these public benefits, the ecosystems, which we know now in the 21st century that we ought to be protecting. So part of the question is, how do we allocate the water that we already have? And I wish I could say there was an easy answer to that. And if we were redesigning the system today from scratch, it would look a lot different, but we're not. And this gets back to some of the earlier conversations about water markets and water rights. Academically, I sort of like the idea of water markets, but I also understand that we have a water rights structure that has a serious dispute right now about who really has rights to do what. Are they property rights versus use rights? Can you really sell a water right when it's a public good? How do ecosystems participate in that? So I'm not sure I can answer the question, except to say that water is a public good, and yet there are economic benefits and private benefits as well that we want to support, and we have to do a better job of balancing them than we've done. And I'll leave it at that.
Okay, well then let me ask Saul the follow-up question, which is this. When we look around the world, when we look at, we obviously are not starting at square one, but people have come at this from a variety. We heard about Australia earlier. If you were going to point to a water system that seemed to bring out the best benefits broadly in society, what one or ones would you point to, and which of those would be adaptive to the Western United States?
So I don't know everyone's water systems, but I'll point out a few interesting points. So the issue that happened in Australia is actually a terrific example because, well, a few things happened. So I actually visited Australia around 2008, just in the middle of the drought when all of this was happening. And Australia had has tremendous amount of highly productive agriculture in a portion in the south eastern portion of the country for a river basin that crosses 3 or 4 states, the equivalent of their states. And so they had all sorts of different allocative rights issues, and different states had given permission to different people to withdraw water, and then there was a drought, and everyone was pulling out all the water. And basically, the government created a new organization to oversee the entire watershed that crossed and superseded state legitimacy. So they said, you know, the way we've been managing this didn't recognize sort of the natural features of the environment. There's a normal pattern for how the water flows from one state to the next, but it's being managed, and the guy upstream doesn't care what happens to the guy downstream. And we should think about this holistically. And so they basically have started from scratch. They totally re-engineered the whole system, created water markets, and now they have effective, like something that people point to as a highly effective trading regime. So I think that's a great example. Like when I visited, no one thought that was going to happen. Okay, so people said that's impossible, but people found a way to make it happen, and initially some states were more reticent than others, but they were eventually convinced and brought on board. And once people saw how it functioned, and it could actually function in their favor, people were more willing to buy into it. In another case, so that's on the market end, I actually also recently visited Israel, and they actually conduct agriculture in a fantastically dry environment. And so, I mean, what the technology that they use in terms of getting more crop for drop is really remarkable. They have irrigation systems where they are, in contrast to flood irrigation, where you basically just douse a field, they have little tubes that carry water right to the base of the plant and deliver water directly to the roots of each individual crop. Okay, so tremendous water efficiency, a huge amount of value delivered per drop. And so thinking about sort of what types of technologies they employ and what can we transplant to this context, I think could be extremely profitable.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the policy. I'd like to ask Wade about the politics. Because obviously, you know, you can't really design a policy in a vacuum, and there are interested parties who, you know, have current rights and have current interests and would like to see those protected and enhanced. So when you think about California water policy or Western water policy in the context of water rights, who are the biggest players? Who are the people who are pushing the hardest? And how is that reflected in the way that you have to deal in the real world?
Another easy question. You know, I think the conventional wisdom or the soundbite that would describe, you know, the historical understanding of water in California is, you know, this model of, or paradigm of farms versus fish, cities versus agriculture, this zero-sum game where powerful interests are banging up each other, and what results is not a lot of systemic improvement to increasing reliability, resilience, ecological sustainability, right? So that's the script, and probably everybody in the room knows that script exists. I think we're in a very interesting time now because the crisis of the drought has brought opportunity. And as the governor mentioned, you know, many folks would argue, and I would say correctly, that we might not have gotten groundwater reform legislation over the finish line if there had not been a drought. Public opinion polls of the water bond prior to this winter suggested it wasn't largely supported. This water action plan that we put together, again, you know, got everyone's attention because I think all of these interests understand we have to do something differently. So I don't want to be Pollyanna, but I think that the stars have sort of aligned for, yeah, knock on wood, for a new approach. And I'm not presupposing Proposition 1 passes, but the stars have aligned for this new approach. And I think when the governor's water action plan was released, it had over 100 groups, the same groups that I mentioned, you know, commenting on it. The end result was actually largely embraced by groups because it didn't take sides. It didn't suggest there's a silver bullet. It really took this portfolio approach, which is an overused term, but it is true. You know, the Water Action Plan says, yes, we need more storage, but it needs to be smart storage, underground storage with some surface storage in conjunctive use. Yes, we need robust habitat restoration. But we also need to be much more efficient in the water that we use. We need to maximize water recycling, stormwater runoff, et cetera. And so the water bond, to answer part of your previous question, is really a down payment on that portfolio approach. If it passes, it actually invests in the infrastructure, because some of this is about policy and innovation. Some of this is about getting infrastructure to enable that policy innovation. So, you know, I actually think while there are strong political forces with strong opinions around what we should do, we've got an opportunity over the next 4 years to actually make changes that both provide reliability for water users, but also help restore the ecological habitat and prepare us for climate change. So I'm actually, despite my fairly depressing answer to the impacts of climate change, I'm fairly optimistic about what we can do.
Politically. So I want you guys to think of questions to ask. I'll ask one more question so you get a chance to really think about it. But Peter, let me take you back to an earlier answer you gave, which had to do about the dichotomy between adaptation and mitigation. In California, we have very progressive energy laws designed to deal, within the confines of California with mitigation. And we're also dealing, the water bond is a perfect example of us also trying to deal with adaptation. As you look around, can you see, when you think about society trying to deal with both of those things simultaneously, do you see the pressure on adaptation that everybody obviously feels? It's a local human pressure, pretty much regardless of where you are. Can you conceive of society being able to deal with both at the same time? The energy laws are from 2006 to some extent and before. And in a lot of places, they're dealing with specific problems the way we are on an adaptation basis that are expensive, real, and immediate. And does that make mitigation go to the back burner? Is the basic question.
Yeah, so I think the good news here is that we're already doing some remarkable things. I think we're making a lot of progress. Agriculture's making the kinds of changes that Solomon talked about. We have drip irrigation, although we could have a lot more. All of our sectors could be more efficient. The kinds of wastewater treatment and reuse that was described earlier is an adaptation to a climate where there's not enough water to go around. Stormwater capture is an adaptation. The groundwater work that we're talking about, I think those are the right things that we want to do in the context of climate change, with or without climate change. In a normal year in California, there's not enough water to go around. This isn't just a drought climate change issue. But the other connection is that there's a very strong link between our energy use and our water use. There's been a lot of discussion about the water requirements for our energy systems. Power plants take a lot of water. That's true. But the flip side of that is it takes a tremendous amount of energy to run our water systems. The biggest single consumer of power in the state of California is the pumps that lift water over the Tehachapi Mountains into the Los Angeles Basin, which is part of the reason why the earlier question about why aren't we pumping water from Canada or the Mississippi River isn't going to happen. It's hugely energy intensive. Saving a gallon of water in the Los Angeles Basin is a smarter idea than saving the same gallon of water in San Francisco. Not that that's a bad idea either, because it takes more energy to get it there and more greenhouse gases. So if we think about energy and water together, there are all sorts of opportunities to improve the efficiency of our system, meet our water needs, cut our energy use, reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. That's the mitigation adaptation link. That's why we have a tremendous opportunity to do both at a time when we have no choice but to do both.
Okay. I have a question right there.
John Massey, TechVisor. So I have a question actually for all five of you. You get one too. And this is about the effect on handling of climate change from the fairly well-organized political machinery that would rather not have any mitigation and obscure the cost of adaptation, and in particular seems to want to keep science out of public policy. Now, I know Tom has done some wonderful stuff in funding action in the political arena, and I know Peter has jousted with some of the same think tanks I chase, we know them well, that try to help this. So the question for you is, to what extent do you see this, both in California and nationally, since that matters, and what can the rest of us do to make sure that science informs public policy?
Well, I think that what we're doing right now today is a great example of that communication, and here in the room and on the World Wide Web, broadcasts and all that. So I think that this kind of forum is really critical. I also think that, to get back to what Peter was saying about what some people call win-wins. So there's a lot that we can do to improve our resilience to extreme events, for example, in the current climate, and that's going to those are actions that we can take that are going to also improve our resilience to climate change. So I think if there are anything that we can do that's going to be a good idea now, we in the U.S. over the last decade we've had something on the order of 70 individual extreme weather and climate disasters that have each had at least $1 billion in losses, and a number of them much more than 1 billion. And so that's an indication that we're not adapted to the climate that we have right now, and so we can improve hopefully without there being a lot of debate about whether mitigation versus adaptation. I mean, if it's a good idea now and it's going to give us increasing resilience in the future, then it seems like a relatively clear path forward.
I think part of the answer lies in continuing to build the model of what we've been able to build in California. We have the 8th largest economy in the world. Our economic recovery has outpaced the rest of the country while we've reduced emissions, and we're going to meet our AB 32 goal, and then with the governor's leadership go beyond that, while we're bringing on a third of our energy system will be renewable, while we're plugging in 100,000 cars, electric vehicles, while our energy footprint is half of the rest of the country. So part of it is, this is not a boutique economy. This is a large, robust economy that's showing we can actually grow and reduce climate emissions or carbon emissions. The second piece is what the governor's doing in terms of spreading this message. The governor and our administration are deeply involved with China, India, Mexico. Governor spoke at the United Nations last month. He may be in Lima for the next conference of parties, and then in Paris in 2015. He's talked about that publicly. So part of it, from our standpoint, is showing we can continue to reduce emissions in California while growing our economy, and then part of it is sharing that with the rest of the world and finding those other exemplary climate leaders to help move our nation states towards international agreement on climate.
But obviously, you're not talking about deep blue states like California. You're talking about states where there are politicians who understand that there are human immediate needs and problems that they'd like to have taken care of. They'd like billions of dollars of federal aid, but they really don't want to spend any time or conversation on mitigation because they really aren't sure if climate change is happening, and they're not scientists, and that's above their pay grade. And
wait, scientists are above their pay grade?
Well, let me say, it's a confused statement at the best of times. Your specific problem with it. And so the question is, how is that line of argument, which isn't much of a line of argument, going to be countered so that they eventually have to come in and deal with the realities and the scientific research? And that's an ongoing process of trying to counter those statements and do exactly what Peter's talking about, which is to combine the two. We know we have to deal with adaptation, but we also have to deal with mitigation, because if you really listen to what Noah's saying, if we continue on this path, our current adaptation plans become moot. And so the question is, what do you say to someone who says, I am not a scientist? Well, they're also not a doctor or an architect. So there are a number of other public policy issues where they don't have a PhD, and by that line of argument shouldn't have anything to say either. So I think over time, this is going to be kind of a question of, do Americans see through that, and do they see it not so much in terms of the scientific argument, but do they see that as an unacceptable answer for someone holding a really high office of trust and making decisions on their behalf on the most essential questions? That's really going to be the question. Yes, ma'am?
I know we've mentioned population is a tough.
Hang on one sec.
I know we've mentioned that talking about population growth. Hi, I'm Joy Alico, and I call myself a business surgeon, helping companies during their improve their processes and systems. Well, I'm here because I want to get involved in this industry. And we're talking about population changes, one of the variables we can't talk about. We talked, if we look at history, some of our strength came to urbanization. What about, and Peter, you mentioned that we can't just look at one variable here. We have to look at energy and water. There's a capacity to some cities. I know we heard it might not be an issue, but do we need to rethink about how we're going to live in the future, or where we're going to live? Is there a way that we can move businesses around so that there's the water, I mean, if they dry up, we're gonna have to look at migration patterns and new ways of living. So how do we factor that into this whole equation that we know is very difficult to talk about?
Peter, do you want to take a shot?
Yeah, so I talk about population all the time. I don't think it's off the table. It certainly shouldn't be. I agree with that. But really part of that is we obviously have to meet the water needs and the resource needs of the populations we have, which we're not doing a great job of. Again, even in a wet year, some of these disadvantaged communities don't have safe drinking water, and that's just ridiculous at a state like California. But it raises the question about land use planning and urban planning and the design of our cities. And there was some conversation in the earlier panels about rethinking our wastewater infrastructure and moving away from the centralized approaches we've used. And whether we want lawns as, you know, there's a whole series of questions that come up embedded in your question about the design of the way we live. And I think part of the answer is going to be, over time, we're changing those things. We will inevitably change those things. I would like to think that in 50 years, people are going to look back and think, green lawns, what were we thinking? Flushing toilets with potable drinking water, what were we thinking? And of course, what we were thinking was water was unlimited and we could do anything we wanted. But that's changing. And I think part of the question you're asking is a fundamental change in the way we think about the way we live.
No?
Well, so a couple things. One is that my 13-year-old daughter just 2 weeks ago asked me, why are we flushing our toilet with potable drinking water? So people are already, at least in my house, asking that question.
Brilliant.
Yeah. But more seriously, I think it's important that we, I think it's important that we look outside of California at the global scale, because really and again, this is something that came out in the latest IPCC report, that the difference between the 2-degree world that the United Nations has identified as a target and the 4-degree world that is really the business as usual that the world is on, it's really the difference between us, the whole global population more or less progressing towards looking like I do in terms of my energy consumption and my carbon-based lifestyle, times billions of people. Or this 2-degree world that the UN has identified is really a world where carbon emissions go to 0 and then eventually negative. I mean, it's a carbon-free global economy. That's what's required to get to that 2-degree world. And this is really, to me, this makes it very obvious that it's not a mitigation or an adaptation question. The 2-degree world requires a lot of mitigation, and it's a world in which we still need adaptation.
Absolutely.
You know what, in a 4-degree world, we're going to see people moving out of the Southwest back to the north, to the cooler climates. We're going to see population migration in the US in reverse of what we've seen in the past century. We're going to have conversations in a 4-degree world that we're not having today about crop type in California and about how much land really ought to be under irrigation, which we don't want to talk about now because the political questions are much more difficult than just improving efficiency or wastewater reuse or building new storage. So climate change is going to change, will change the nature of the conversation as well.
Go ahead.
Quick question. I'm David Hayes, a former Fed, now a refugee here, visiting professor at the law school. Quick question, specific question on adaptation. You guys made a very strong case about the loss of snowpack. One of the immediate reactions is more storage. Storage is part of the bond. I noticed that Lake Mead and Lake Powell are not filling up. What's the situation now in terms of a large off-stream reservoir potentially in California, and whether that makes sense given the difference in hydraulic cycles? Will we be able to essentially replicate the Sierra snowpack with conventional storage or not? Is there a relationship here between the climate science and the cost effectiveness of the traditional reservoir answer, or are we going to look for more modern storage answers than that traditional one?
So if I could tackle that one, at least to start. The easy response to the we're losing snowpack storage is build more storage. But we don't live in that world anymore. I'm sorry, but we can never replace the loss of snowpack storage with new storage in California, because we've built on all the good dam sites and some not so good dam sites. We might build a couple more reservoirs. There might be one off-stream storage sites reservoir. That's not going to solve our problem. There is enormous potential for groundwater storage. And I think rethinking what we mean by storage is the answer. It's not to say yes storage, no storage. It's what kind of storage. We overpump groundwater even in a good year, and as Wade noted, enormously in a bad year. But if we can recharge groundwater really effectively, at the same time as we're restoring ecosystems because we're spreading water more, we're restoring wetlands that permit recharge, that storage could really be the climate, could help with the climate management problem. But even that may not be enough. We may have to change the way we think about seasonal management overall.
So you guys, I got about 1 minute ago, I got the high sign that there was 1 minute to go. So I want to say thank you very much to these four panelists.